like to paraphrase Chuck saying that CCUS is required nowadays. And then here we can see why, because CCUS has a lot of impact in different industries. We can see refining, LNG, fertilizers, petrochemicals, iron, steel, and cement. And then in a net zero scenario, we expect that CO2 will account for 7% of reduction through 2050. Another point that has been well discussed today was policy support. So here we can see a graph on global level of CCUS policy support. The darkest color represent the places where we have higher support, and then as the color goes lighter, the support decreases. And then we see that North America and the European Union are the place with the highest policy support on CCUS nowadays. So it's hard to talk about US policy support without mentioning the Inflation Reduction Act. We talked about this during Udai's Outlook this morning, but just a brief intro. DARE is going to level up and incentivize CCUS and DEC with a tax credit of $85 per ton on CCUS and up to $180 for DEC. And then these plants need to be in construction until 2033. Sorry. We also have a multi-client deck. We can answer all your questions for a fair price. So if you're interested, please contact us. And then talking a little bit about DEC, we see that most facilities are located in North America and Europe, but we see new projects coming up globally. And then our last slide on DEC is it's a timeline of DEC projects and capacity by end use, and then we do expect that in the near term, DEC will utilize CO2 that's being captured, but in the long term, we see a lot of projects in storage. And that's it. Let's go to our panelists. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us today. We have Oliver from Blue Sky Infrastructure, Jem from Carbonvert, and then Cole from Sundyne. We can start with a brief introduction and then where your company plays on the CCUS value chain. We can start with you, Oliver.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. Can you hear me? Yeah. So, Oliver Tuckerman, I am a co-founder, co-president of Blue Sky Infrastructure. Blue Sky Infrastructure is a developer of carbon capture and sequestration infrastructure projects. Our focus is in the U.S., and within the U.S., it is the U.S. Gulf Coast. The reason for the focus within the U.S. Gulf Coast, because that was an early decision we made, was because you have suitable geology and you also have a significant amount of industrial emissions. Our thesis was around the industrial segment, not so much power generation, but heavy industry like cement, iron, chemicals, even pulp and paper, throw in that basket, lime production, et cetera, would need to decarbonize. They are a substantial size of the addressable CO2 market, and if we want to get to net zero, they need to be handled, and they don't have a lot of low-hanging fruit ways to materially decarbonize. And so our view was that's where CCS should play a role. And if we look at the Gulf Coast, about 50% of US heavy industrial emissions are in an area or in the region where we have good suitable geology. And when I say suitable geology, we're looking for porous and permeable sandstone formations that sit beneath impermeable layers that will prevent the CO2 from moving up into underground sources of drinking water and back out into the atmosphere, which is critical. If you're going to do this, you got to make sure that it's permanently stored. And so, we planted our initial flag with our first project in Louisiana, where we have a large-scale CO2 storage hub project that caters to the industrial and chemical corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, where there's about 60 existing industrial facilities that sit shoulder to shoulder along the Mississippi River. And for us, what was the intriguing feature for the business opportunity that we saw, which is, again, we're an infrastructure developer, was that sites that would be able to accommodate a lot of CO2 that would result in the lowest cost solution and the lowest execution risk were the scarce resource. That was our thesis, because anybody can go lease up land, and the barrier to enter is very low. But our view was really high quality sites where you could put multiple wells very close to each other that would allow for very efficient, scalable expansion were the scarce resource. And when we put a host of criteria into a sieve looking for sites, because in our minds this area was very obvious that CCS was going to happen. It's the second most concentrated cluster of existing industrial emissions outside of the Houston area on a ton of CO2 per square mile, and so it was very obvious that that'll happen. There are low-hanging fruit, meaning some high quality sources of CO2 there that just require compression dehydration and don't necessarily require post-combustion capture, which is very expensive. And so there was a path for certain development, like high certainty, you're going to have a project. And so we went out and we put a bunch of criteria into a sieve, and some of that criteria was avoidance of existing oil and gas wells, avoidance of wetlands, avoidance of population centers, being able to leverage existing infrastructure like roads and power, because we will need power in the field for subsurface injection of CO2. And there were even more criteria than that. But when we put that into a sieve, we honestly didn't find any other site that met this criteria. And so then the question was going and getting the land, which did take a lot of work because it's all privately owned land, and we leased the right to inject CO2 underneath this land. And we had to cobble together over 50 land deals to make it happen, to put together, our 32,000 acre position. And so that is our Louisiana project, where we have a site. We have drilled a well to 11,000 feet to collect 650 feet of core data that went to a laboratory to be evaluated, and all of that takes a lot of time. It's been about a year, 9 months of going through the laboratory work, et cetera. And so we filed 7 Class 6 well permits with the EPA. Those permits have now been taken on by the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources that now has primacy, so that's good. And we have spent significant dollars developing the project so far, and now we just need commercial contracts. And the only thing that's kind of gotten in the way there is a little bit of competition, but we believe the market is large enough that there's enough to go around. And so that's our primary project where we have spent the most time and effort. The second project we have is in Alabama that is not a large-scale storage hub. It is a full-service solution for a pulp and paper mill operator that has 1.5 million tons of CO2 that we will provide capture, transport, and storage. The capture will be post-combustion capture, so it's expensive. But the reason we think the opportunity is interesting is because we have a biogenic CO2 source that we believe will, if captured and sequestered underground, will generate carbon removal credits that will add an additional revenue stream to the project. Because generally speaking, and I'm sure there'll be questions about this, but post-combustion capture just is not economic with the 45Q tax credit at 85. It doesn't work. So you need additional revenue streams and grant funding, and we will go for all of the above. But it's hard, and so those are the 2 projects. We've received DOE grant funding for both of them, and so that's been helpful. But again, those processes are very long. So sorry, that was a little bit of a long-winded intro.
Thank you, Oliver.
Yeah.
Jim?
Hi, I'm Jan Sherman. I'm the co-founder and chief development officer of Carbonvert, and similar to Blue Sky, Carbonvert is a startup focused on project development in the CCS projects in the U.S. And so, when we started Carbonvert in late 2020, we were looking at 4 kind of investment thesis around ethanol, where you've got single source and sinks, hubs where you have large emission sources in the central area, and developing out large storage sites onshore and offshore, and then EOR, and I can't even remember what the 4th one was, but cement or something. It was a use case, and so we weren't quite as focused as Blue Sky. So, but then just as you're starting up these companies, you have events that happen, and so that it's like good team, good timing, good luck really starts to drive what works in these startups. And so our first project was responding to an RFP that the state of Texas issued, and it was for offshore storage in state waters in Jefferson County, which is in southeast Texas. And as we were working on the RFP response for Carbonvert, certainly a big scoring criteria was you need an offshore operator. And so, luckily, one of our investors introduced us to Talos Oil Company as we partnered with Talos, because they had offshore operations experience, and Carbonvert had this expertise around developing large projects, including CCS, as well as financing and tax equity investments. And so we combined our teams, and we formed Bayou Bend, which is now an offshore storage site that Chevron is operating, and it's moving forward. And so that that kind of set the investment thesis for Carbonvert to where we're now. We've got 5 projects that we're working on. A couple of onshore projects. They're smaller, single source to sink opportunities, and then we exited Bayou Bend. Not intentionally, but Equinor made it economically attractive for us to do that. But it was right at the same time that we knew we were getting awards for an offshore project in state waters in Corpus Christi, and then another project in offshore state waters of Louisiana. And so with those 3 offshore projects, then you start to frame out an investment thesis where I'm going to go to areas where there's large emission sources and ports that bring product in and out. So you have feedstock for your existing industrial, as well as industrial growth. And with that industrial growth often comes green products and low carbon products. And then I think, as we've talked about all day long, that all of these energy transition projects right now require CCS. And so that's what Carbonvert is focused on. We've got these large 10 to 20 million ton per year storage projects that we're developing in the offshore or near onshore in the Gulf Coast, and really looking for customers who are capturing their CO2 and looking for an easy access to transport and storage within close proximity, so within 30 to 50 miles of where you're either have an existing facility that needs CO2 storage, or whether you're building a greenfield project. And so I'm really excited to talk to you guys about that today.
Thank you, Jim. Cole?
Yep, great to be here. I guess I'll start with just talking a little bit about who Sundyne is. So we are a design and manufacturer of mission control pumps and compressors. We've got a pretty broad portfolio. Historically and today we play in energy, so refining, LNG, petrochemical, but we also have a strong presence in industrial and chemical markets. And then renewables, which is why I'm here today, is a segment that we've had for a couple of years. We're about 1,000 employees. We have facilities in Arvada, Colorado, where our headquarters is, France, UK, Spain, and India. We're backed by a private equity partner in Warburg Pincus, who's been very supportive in the investments that we've made in renewables. And a couple of years back, we created a business unit specifically focusing on this. And within that, it was interesting listening to Lydia earlier this morning. We have 4 segments. So hydrogen, carbon capture, renewable fuels, and then we have a separate industrial business that's focusing on EV batteries and lithium. So it's great to kind of see that alignment. It's been exciting times where I heard a lot of first of a kind project today, and that's exactly what we've been doing. We've been doing a lot of pilot plants, a lot of first of a kind projects. Most recently, you guys heard about the opening or the first ethanol to jet plant that opened up. It was great for us to participate in that. Before that, there was a kind of large-scale ammonia production facility in Qatar. We were a part of that program. We're seeing a lot of exciting activities happening in the Pathway Alliance project in Canada. We've got an application where we're blending hydrogen into natural gas pipelines. We've got renewable natural gas opportunities. So just kind of touching on a lot of the topics that were talked about today. So that's great to see. And I'll talk a little bit more about carbon capture today during this talk.
Thank you, Carl. So this question is for all of you. CCUS is seeing rapid expansion activity. How do you see CCUS today, and where is headed?
That's what I'm doing.
Okay. I can start there. So from my vantage point, again, it's a bit perhaps microscopic. We certainly see CCUS, happening, and I can't really speak so much about the U, but the CCS in our neck of the woods, like specifically in Louisiana, where we spent the most time developing our project. As I mentioned, there are some streams of CO2 that just require compression and dehydration. Those are primarily coming off of ammonia facilities, and those projects are moving ahead because the economics work, and it's actually a fairly attractive economic return and an economic proposition for the owner of that CO2, or at least the emitter of that CO2, because 85 is more than sufficient. And so we see that happening. I see, more of those projects, I see the low-hanging fruit projects are going to get done, at least in the Gulf Coast. The harder to decarbonize projects like, post-combustion capture on a chemical facility or a cement kiln, or, even on a pulp and paper mill, those require air separation. They require basically either an amine solvent type of technology or a new type of technology. And I don't see a tremendous amount of activity on that front, just because how does somebody get comfortable spending $500 million to $1 billion to install that type of equipment without a business plan, or at least if there's no, if the carrot isn't big enough, there needs to be a stick. And I'm not seeing that in my area, and we believe that will eventually come, but that is kind of something where I see, like, the industry today is pretty niche, but it has a potential to be large in scale and large in scope, particularly if the power side of the equation were to enter the mix. Like, the EPA came out with these rules that would make gas and coal plants, decarbonize pretty dramatically, and essentially requiring CCS. And whether or not that happens and whether or not that passes and moves, ahead is still, to be determined. But if it did, it would result in significant CCS activity, more so in the 2030s for gas-fired power, and maybe some by the late 20s for coal-fired power.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, I think that where we are today is it is niche or ad hoc, and you see the low-hanging fruit projects moving forward, but you also see that storage is critical path for a lot of these decisions, because it's going to take me longer, 5 to 7 years to develop out the storage sites. And the capture projects, once we decide to make those investments, then you're really talking about 18 to 36 months. But it's kind of flipped on the investment side. About a third of the investment is probably around the transport and storage, and then you've got still these large capture investments. And so there's some big decisions that we're trying to pace where we can develop storage sites and capture projects and line up permitting and final investment decisions and on-stream dates so that we can all capture the value of what we're making these investments on. And so I think it'll be more ad hoc, or companies that have decided that they need it, either because the power sector is starting to see that this is coming, that they're going to be regulated to do it, or you have a blue or low carbon product that needs it, and so those projects are going to move forward even if they're a little bit more expensive than the 45Q allows. And so what we're seeing right now from a storage development perspective is that customers have a lot of choices. But as we get closer to the 2032 start of construction date under the IRA, then we're going to see more and more of these capture projects getting into feed and trying to start construction by that date. And so I think that for the storage sites that we're developing now, the customers have choices, but I think that those sites will be ready for 2030, 2032, and that the customers will start to be storage short at that point. So, so that's what we need to watch for and try to make sure that we're lining up our investments and our early development work so that we're all ready, because that 2032 cutoff date's coming sooner than we think.
Yeah, and I guess I'll talk about it from a supplier's perspective, and I think a lot of what I'll say will somewhat agree with what Jan and Oliver talked about. I mean, I really think about it in three different...
Only somewhat.
Only somewhat. I think I'll talk about it in like 3 buckets. Obviously policy, we've talked about it a lot today. The cost economics of carbon capture or blue hydrogen is today better than green. So I think from that perspective, the 45Q in the US is viewed as favorable. In Canada, they're even looked at as more favorable, given they give some upfront funding on capital equipment. And then the second piece is around geology and infrastructure. Oliver mentioned where we have existing wells today. Obviously, these projects are going to be the low-hanging fruit. But for example, we look at kind of the ethanol plant corridor is really ideal for carbon capture, but they don't have the pipeline or well infrastructure today. So we'll look at that as potentially a good medium to long-term opportunity. And then the final piece is really on technology. So when we see what type of capture technologies customers are asking for, they're technologies that are mature today, but might not be the most efficient or most economical. So we see, again, these low-hanging projects going through with some of the more mature yet inefficient technologies as they work on developing better technologies for the future.
Thank you.
And then I just have one other piece to add on top of what somebody else said, which was the regulatory piece. It's very unproven at this point. I'm talking about geologic sequestration wells, so Class 6 wells. There haven't been many permits issued. And a company, for example, that was or is planning to build a $3 billion blue hydrogen or blue ammonia facility, and it doesn't, let's just say it doesn't want to handle the transportation and storage of the CO2. It's going to outsource that to somebody else. they are going to be laser focused on, does that project have the permits to be able to inject that CO2 under, EPA regulations, et cetera. And Jan had mentioned it takes a long time for that to come through, and it certainly does, and you have to do a lot of work to get it on the front end. But those are critical for them to be able to make their investment decisions. And so I'm not expecting the regulatory dynamic to really speed up significantly, but it would certainly help. And given that this is still at the early days of its maturity, that it's just going to be slow to get going. But once hopefully it does get going and permits get issued and everybody sees how the industry is operating and using best practices, it hopefully will move faster.
But we've seen a lot of movement just in the last, just really in the last 3 years, and the IRA certainly helped generate a lot more interest. And so I think that interest that we're seeing now is going to convert to action as we get into the later half of this decade, and I think we'll be well positioned for having a lot of these projects coming on in the 2030 to 2035 timeframe. But we have a lot of work to do and a lot of commitments from all of you to get there. So,
thank you. So we touched a little bit about the short term, but where and how CCUS can scale more? Cole, we can start with you.
Sure. I talked about it a little bit. I think when we talk about infrastructure, and we talk about where heavy industry is, I would say areas where there isn't infrastructure today, but heavy industry where the CO2 emitters could be an ideal candidate for decarbonization. And I think the other piece is more around technology advancements. I think, part of the biggest challenge that we have today is when we deal with some of our conventional customers, these are customers with really stringent API type requirements that are difficult to scale and really drive up the cost of design and production, which makes the economics really challenging. So as that technology advances, as there's more collaborations between really across the entire value chain on how do you scale and how do you bring costs down, I'd say that's a very critical part as well.
Yeah, I think it has. You see it already. It has to be about the cost, and we know this from all the oil and gas projects that we've built over the last several decades, is that where we can leverage repeat applications and scale, then we can start to drive down the cost. And we're just not there yet with CCS or any of these blue and green technologies. And so as we start to deploy more and more projects, then we will start to see that cost come down. But it's still, our biggest challenge when we think about capture investments. And then the other part of that is that we're still seeing custom solutions. And so until we can start to have more generic solutions that we can apply in a modular and a repeatable fashion, it's a catalog rather than every time you show up at my plant, it's a new design, and I think that's where we'll start to see the cost improvements.
Absolutely.
Sorry, what was the question about scale? What was the question?
We're just making up answers to her questions.
Yeah.
How and where can CCUS scale?
Got it. Well, just talking about it from where I think about the world, a CO2 storage hub is very efficient, but it needs a lot of volume to be efficient. If you just have one emitter that has 100,000 tons, the unit cost is ridiculously high, and they won't do the storage and transportation piece of the equation may kill the project. So that's one of the challenges that we face as a developer of, maybe we get an emitter that has 500,000 tons to get started. Well, are we willing to underwrite that, assuming we get to scale, meaning price their product or price our service, based on us being at scale and taking that risk? And that's, something that, is front and center in our minds, but scale is key. And that's one of the reasons for our project in Alabama, where we went after this pulp and paper mill, because it has 1.5 million tons of CO2, and we will generate another 300,000 or 400,000 of CO2 from the energy we will need, or the emissions we will generate from running a combined heat and power plant to power the capture plant. And so we're almost at 2 million tons. We need that type of scale to make the math work.
But I think scale too is going to have to include the offshore. And so I think the onshore sites are 50 landowners, a couple million tons of CO2 storage. And then when you get offshore, you've got single landowners. It's either state, and I'm talking about near shore. We're not talking about going out to deep water here, but you've got 3 to 10 mile areas that are state owned. So you've got a single landowner, you've got gigatons of storage in the saline formation there, and I think you're starting to see the state of Texas really monetize that resource for their offshore bid rounds, and then the state of Louisiana has a couple of offshore leases. But the onshore is a shorter term solution too, and so it's all of the above that has to happen.
Thank you. So talking a little bit about storage, CO2 storage, Jim and Oliver, what are the markets that are taking more interest in storage today?
I mean, I mentioned it a little bit. It's about the people that need it, and so you either need it because your company has decided that you're going to lead the decarbonization of, for instance, steel, and so we see that in the Corpus Christi area, or you already have a product like a renewable diesel or a SAF. We talked about some of those products, and those products need CCS, and so those are the customers that have the most interest right now. We are starting to see in the last kind of 6 months an uptick from the power industry. You start to see movement in that sector because they're starting to believe that they're going to get pressure from the governments to do that. And then the international markets are really interested in this, and they're looking to the US to supply their ammonia and hydrogen and LNG, and all of those products. They're looking at the offtake to include low carbon, at least CCS. And so I think those are going to be the fast movers.
I agree with all of those comments. From what we see is anyone who has a high purity stream of CO2, either because they already created that, right? If you're in the ammonia business, you are separating out CO2 as part of the input of natural gas that you turn into hydrogen and then NH3, and so you have to remove the CO2. They're doing it today. They're just venting it. If that's the case, then they'll take the $85 and pay us whatever it takes to take it away, etc. They'll do that all day long. I'm hopeful to see in greater scale some blue ammonia, blue hydrogen, export projects come that want to leverage the low cost of natural gas in America. I'm hopeful to see that. A lot of projects have been pushed back because they're just not getting contracts with long-term contracts that they want to see to underpin their investments. Those are the kind of the $3 billion type investments. But I do think that will come, and that will, I think, be a large catalyst for significant demand for storage by the end of this decade.
Thank you. Cole, from a turbomachinery point of view, what are the key CCUS markets where Sundyne products are more relevant?
Yeah, I'd say it's a lot of the markets that were just mentioned, right? You look at the current consumers of hydrogen, ammonia and refining are the top ones. I think these are the primary ones we're going after. And biofuels, I think, is another one. We talked about SAF earlier. SAF is specifically alcohol to jet, where they're going to need decarbonized ethanol. So I think once that infrastructure is in place, I think these will go. Our European team has mentioned some excitement around steel and cement, although given that these are a little bit harder to decarbonize, we're kind of thinking about those maybe a little bit more long-term. But also, if I just think about like the entire value chain, we also see a lot of play in the utilization piece. So as ammonia as an example, where it's mostly used in the production of fertilizer, that actually needs CO2 as a feedstock. So as ammonia produces CO2, it's being utilized in the urea production process. So I look at that as a really great application. I'd say another one is the production of synthetic fuels, so either e-methanol or e-SAF is another great, potential utilization opportunity where you have both either green or blue hydrogen production mixed with carbon capture or captured carbon.
Thank you. We touched a little bit about costs and economics in storage, but Oliver and Jim, could you elaborate on the costs and economics and how do you expect it's going to evolve in the future?
Yeah. So in terms of cost, it's very, specific to the parameters that you provide, meaning how far is the source from the storage site, how large is the volume, and drilling a well is what it is, but building pipeline infrastructure is very expensive, and there has been talk about leveraging existing gas pipelines and moving CO2 in a gaseous state. We were never comfortable doing that because there's liability risk that somebody needs to wear, and so our model was always we want to make sure we control as much of the value chain as possible with new infrastructure. But folks have evaluated that it's inefficient to move CO2 in a gaseous state as opposed to a dense phase or supercritical phase. It's much more efficient to do that. And all said and done, when we think about like the levelized cost of storage for a hub, call it $20 a ton, give or take. But that assumes you have scale, and when I say scale, as a developer, we'd be happy with 3 to 4 million tons. Less than that, yeah, if we believe we can get there, sure, but those are again very specific to the amount of pipeline infrastructure and where. Building pipe in West Texas is a lot cheaper than building pipe in South Louisiana. South Louisiana, even small diameter pipes, $4 million a mile. West Texas is $2 million a mile. Just because it's really wet, you have expensive right of way, etc. So it really just depends where.
Yeah, and I think that we're seeing, transport and storage, capturing about a third of 45Q. So you're looking at $20 to $30 a ton. And to Oliver's point, depending on how far you are, the distance between the sources and the sinks. And so if you're in an area where you have a lot of friends with emissions, and you're able to share that infrastructure so that you can get to the scale where in total we're delivering 4+ million tons through the system, then I think that you'll be on the lower end of that cost curve. But and being early also will help, because we're looking to bring in the emissions that allow us to take a final investment decision, and so having that early anchor opportunity, I think, does also create cost benefits for our customers. But really think about it as about a third of 45Q.
Thank you. And Cole, we know that compressor choice is a big topic on
That's
CCUS.
the most expensive thing.
That's exactly. Can you discuss about it?
Yeah, and it's a little bit what I mentioned earlier. I think, one of the most important things that we're trying to do differently now, specifically on projects that are happening today, is really focus on early engagement. We're talking pre-FEED, engineering engagement, and a lot of kind of iterative approaches to how we come up with our final solution. And really kind of, in a lot of cases, challenge the customer on what their requirements are and where there could be trade-offs, and start those commercial aspects first, as opposed to find the technical solution, make the best thing, over-engineer it, and then talk about the commercial piece later. So I think that's first and foremost. And then I think the second piece is really around understanding what the latest technologies are and who the technology leaders in those spaces are. So primarily, we deal with whether it's EPCs or licensors on specific solutions. So if somebody's working on an amine absorption solution, how do we engage with that customer? And you hear a lot of customers talking about, we've created this modular solution that applies to all of these different applications. So we're trying to engage from that aspect. We have a solution now, for example, with an EPC out of Europe for a 200 kiloton per annum facility, right? How scalable is that? We'll have to see as we go, and I'm sure it's not going to be perfect, standard off the shelf. It never is, but I think that's the approach. And I think the final piece is there probably needs to be more engagement with developers as well, because we're doing the same thing. We're looking more upstream to our suppliers and their suppliers, and trying to figure out how do we get them to scale with us so we can get a more optimized cost.
Well, and the compression's in the middle, right? And so you've got a receiving pressure and a delivery pressure, and if we're working together to design an efficient and a cost-effective system, then we can make changes on the receiving end or on the delivery end and kind of optimize that cost. That the compression is a large part of it. And, but if we work in isolation, then maybe your pipeline pressure is higher than is really reasonable for the compression. And so I think that integrated approach is what we're really driving for and pushing for.
Thank you so much, guys. Let's open for questions.
Thanks, ADI, for putting this great panel. My question is that CCS is still at its nascent stage that requires a lot of policy support. And Louisiana State getting its primacy is a welcome move. But at the same time, Louisiana State legislature passed an act that post last injection of the CO2, the liability period extend from 10 years to 50 years. So do you see this as a friendly move, or somewhat a lot of challenges are there because it's an additional cost?
Yeah, I can answer that. So it's up to 50. You can ask the Director of Conservation, or I believe it's somebody within the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources. I believe it's the Director of Conservation. You can ask for a shorter post-injection site care timeline. And if you want to shut it down earlier, you just have to prove to them that it is immobilized, effectively immobilized. And so think of that 50 as up to. It is not hard and fast. So we did not view it as a punch in the mouth.
Yeah, it's more of a practical solution, and I think that when we talk about the CO2 being immobile, we're really looking for pressure stability. And in the Gulf Coast in particular, and this isn't consistent across the entire United States, but these reservoirs are, the best rock properties and the best fluid properties for storing CO2. And so when we start to inject this pressure, the pressure front does get ahead of us a little bit, but when we shut in these sites, our modeling are showing that it's stabilizing very quickly. And that's what, both the state of Louisiana and the state of Texas also has a regulation that allows them to accept liability for their offshore sites, and they're going to be looking for the same thing as pressure stability, which then generates a closure certificate from the EPA, which is then a much easier conversation with the Department of Natural Resources or the state of Texas or whichever state it is. And so that, I think that's how we see that in Louisiana playing out. But it's a great question. And it's not like that for all the states. There's a lot. That's one of the problems with CCS is just the inconsistency between the states and the policy. And that's welcome to the United States of America kind of thing.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So are there any constraints for the purity of the CO2 for underground injection, particularly around sulfur for the CO2? The composition of the CO2?
I mean, I think it's the CO2 specs for storage you definitely don't have to have food grade CO2. That is what a lot of the specs are designed for today. But you do have to make sure that whatever you're injecting is compatible with the rock. And so, and that's one of the things that we do during the early development phase when we get these cores, is that we start to test the rocks, any impact to sulfur or something else on the rock properties, just to make sure you don't inadvertently plug up your injector with something. And so, but the other thing about that is that if you're delivering sulfur in your CO2 stream, that you're taking up space in our pipeline, in our system, and in our storage site. And so it's a commercial science, complicated problem that we're trying to solve. But we're definitely open on our storage sites to working with the customers around what makes sense for us to take in our specs.
Yeah, I have a question about what's your prospect regarding the CCS project profitability or revenue model beyond 45Q? And the same question for DAC.
We don't really talk about DAC at all. I think we're not as bullish as Uday.
So maybe focus on the CCS then.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm maybe explaining, do you count thinking about the carbon market will take over at that?
Yeah,
time?
and so when we make our investment decisions around the projects that we're working on, we're receiving a fee for service on our projects, and so that may be in the form of 45Q or carbon offsets or something else, but it's modeled as a cash tolling fee, and that's what our end of the value chain is likely to receive, because most of the capture facilities, and that's where the direct air capture comes into play, is they're heavily dependent upon 45Q, but then they also, as long as we do a good job on the storage side and on the monitoring side, because they are dependent upon us to deliver that, so as long as we do a good job, then they can also register their projects for the carbon voluntary markets, or attach these carbon credits to their products. But there's a lot of volatility, as many of you know, in this voluntary market. And so we don't count on that for our investments, but we do see that as upside in the market. And our customers that are like our SAF customers, they're definitely counting on some other market, but not necessarily the voluntary markets. And I think the voluntary markets are the big upside opportunity, but so unstable right now that we just can't count on them.
We would want to see a path to investing, in terms of just CapEx to EBITDA 4 to 6 times.
It's much simpler than mine.
Yeah.
To talk to our CEO about that.
I think we will wrap up the panel. Thank you so much, guys, for being here. And let's give a hand to them.